Transparency and trust are the cornerstone of any business. We have all heard this famous quote by Warren Buffett, the legendary investor and owner of Berkshire Hathway. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. Unfortunately, both well-established companies and startups pay little or no attention to safeguarding their reputation. In this month's podcast, we will discuss the impact of fraud on the reputation and brand of a company. Our speaker today is Ms. Nirupama Kaushik. Ms. Kaushik leads the qualitative research and innovation practice globally at Brandscapes Worldwide, a global consulting firm. Ms. Kaushik set up the qualitative research and innovation practice and thus expanded the GMR practice, which hitherto focused on quantitative work. Ms. Kaushik has led multi-country projects and programs, several innovation and ideation workshops, and developed exclusive tools and techniques. Ms. Nirupama Kaushik has 33 years of experience spanning ideation, insight development, cultural understanding, concept communication and product research, and new product development, among others. She has extensive experience across the FMCG, consumer durables, technology, and service sectors. She specializes in facilitation for ideation and has co-developed behavior change protocols. Prior to Brandscapes, Ms. Kaushik has worked in AC Nielsen, Research International, TNS, and Lowe. She's worked in the computer education sector across leading companies. Ms. Nirupama Kaushik has an MBA degree from the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, and a master's in mass communication and journalism from Osmania University. She has received training in facilitation, ideation, and problem solving. A warm welcome, Ms. Kaushik, to the Fraudopedia podcast. First off, I think given your extensive experience and expertise in qualitative research, both globally and in India, what do you see are the similarities and differences in how companies in India perceive their reputation and brand in the marketplace?
Okay, that's an interesting question right off the bat. Yeah. So I think that how companies perceive, themselves and their relationship with their consumers here, or their customers versus the West has been a journey of evolution. Now, to be fair, a lot of that depends on the culture of the organizations. So you might see more similarities when, let's say, an MNC model is being followed because there are certain norms or similarities and policies that need to get, and the degrees of freedom or latitude are different. But for the better part, I think in India, there is a lot to do with the culture of the country as well and how companies are perceived, in that light. So I think that the journey is right now interesting. It's one of transition. But as we would tell people in, our clients in research, that the journey has really been a journey of where the company was the my bap, where there was a very beneficiary, lala kind of, mentality. So there was always a sense of superiority of the organization, over the end. Yes, the products were addressed to them. Maybe the communication and the brands are addressed to them, and there is a lot to, gain from them, and therefore perhaps those channels are all. But in terms of treating them as equals or treating them as someone who really, therefore drives and defines what should be the rules of engagement outside of, the brands or the products or the services that are being offered, has really not been, I think, as open and as up for debate as we see, particularly in some of the Western world. Now, which simply means that the culture was really about companies perceiving that what they do within the confines of their own business and how they choose to conduct it, and what they do really has little to do with the discourse of the consumer and the customer world in general. And that's much more to do with how you're interacting with me through my products, through my brands, through my services. And so that mentality is there. So what is corporate and what is a brand with a face has been different. Sure, brands which have older legacy or companies which are much older would possibly see that sense of responsibility, etc., as a little different. But I think it's not been as open and up for debate, and as now maybe beginning to change because of the world of social media and the virality, and maybe the maturing of the consumer into someone who's, asking about what is happening in general around you. So maybe that'll change over a period of time, and we're just seeing the beginning of it. But for the better part, they've perceived their corporate conduct, their policies, etc., as something which needs to be done. Is probably not in the domain of how you directly interact with end customers or end people, and the two are not necessarily interchangeable. So still a little bit of a top down interaction in that sense.
That's interesting. Now, I think if we look at the lens of reputation through fraud, how does fraud impact a company's reputation and brand? Say, for example, the impact of fraud on, Byju's or Vijay Mallya or Kingfisher.
Right,
You had the Nirav Modi case. So,
right.
what's your take on how does fraud impact companies' reputation?
So sociologically, if we go back and look at it, I think as Indians, we have a sort of a dichotomy in our head about people who do the right thing by others and people who do the smart thing in their business. So the dichotomy manifests in the fact that from a cultural point of view, all the values that we're taught about the straight and the narrow, and about being truthful and being transparent and never harming someone else, etc., I think is in direct conflict many times with what we see as par for the course when it comes to business, right? And I think a lot of the sense of competition and the issues that are there with being part of a very large country where you have to make a competitive mark on yourself means that a lot of the time there is a lot of appreciation for someone who is able to do what we call jugaad, and sort of there is a large, let me say, tolerance for gray, and somebody's dodgy is just someone else's smart, business practice. So, and also there is a sense that how else could you get ahead in business? How else could you make your mark unless you, did things which were smart? Now, they may or may not constitute, fraud in their mind. And if it is in the domain of what they call business practice, I think it becomes fraud in somebody's head when that intersects or interacts with something in my personal life or is linked to people who are, to my aspirations and hopes, for my immediate family or my immediate community. So unless it is personal, for example, it's not seen as something which is, necessarily good or bad. It's neither moral, not nor immoral. It's kind of amoral when it comes to the conduct of some business practice. And if indeed that company was doing something which constitutes fraud, then the consequences for that would be financial, would be, impact their shares and whatever, etc. Now, you mentioned a few examples, and therein lies the dichotomy of how we see fraud. For example, we may perceive Vijay Mallya as having, fraudulently done something, or Nirav Modi as having fraudulently done something. That is what the courts say, that is what the bankers say, that is what the financial world say, and the consequences for that would be governmental, would be restrictions, would be law enforcement, and would be legal, and would be financial. But then do people believe that उनके साथ कोई विश्वासघात हो गई है because Nirav Modi did what he did, or Vijay Mallya did what they did? But because at the very end of the day, those people and their products were seen as interacting with the elites, with perhaps products which give pleasure, but they're not. But Baiju's, it's a different basket case altogether because it hits one of our most foundational belief systems, that education can transform your life and indeed provide a discontinuous leap for the average middle class and lower middle class person. It becomes fraud in the consumer's mind, in the customer's mind, when it involves some of the very important cultural tenets about roti kapda makan, right? If there is a housing fraud, if there is a fraud that is education based, in the case of Byju's, it seems like you were promising a future, to my children, and you were now, and all this is kind of getting in the way of that, and it also then reduces. Even then, I think it would not have been as worrisome for them, but it essentially means that culturally we feel that some people are much more morally important than others. A teacher is one of them. Now, because Ravindran was a teacher and he's linked to education, we somehow feel that the moral burden, that the culpability morally is much higher, because a teacher is meant to embody high standards. So if there was something that happens in the domain where you believe it's culture or it's spirituality or it's it's education or it's housing or it's food, those become in the consumer's mind much more about fraud. Then the fact that they were already frauds in a legal sense, in a corporate sense, in a financial sense. Then, of course, if there are shareholders and they're losing or they're winning or whatever, that's fine. But in a general sense, what domain you operate in and how much I can see the end consequences ripple onto my immediate environment, and how much of that constitutes morally a betrayal of some values that I hold dear. That is the difference between being a fraud or being a businessman or a profit-oriented person who was caught doing the wrong thing. It may still not constitute fraud in that sense to the consumer.
No, that's an interesting take. I think given your background on brand and reputation, but we often hear, I think, among white collar crime investigators, like many of our listeners, that there's a misperception that white collar crime is victimless. That, and you alluded to some of that, where there's a gray line between being smart versus being, doing something which is dodgy, kind of just tip over the line.
Correct.
So that leads on to, that white collar crime is victimless. So how does one educate consumers about this misperception that it's actually not victimless?
Yes, that's a great question. And I think that the fact that white collar crime is victimless is a sort of a very cynical view of the world, which is really about saying that that's nothing much to do with, fraud or anything. It's just to do with, like you said, questionable business practices. And whether it's right or wrong is not the question. Whether you are allowed to, within the ambit of that, to get away with it, and whether you get caught or you don't get caught, that becomes the bigger parameter of it, rather than that it is in an absolute sense right or wrong. But I don't believe that white collar crime is ever victimless. It's just that it is faceless. Every time that comes up and gets visualized for us, that's when we respond to it, because I think what people respond to is the consequences. When the stories, when the actual people, when it gets a face and a story and hands and legs, right? We don't have to go as far as fraud to understand that. The recent tragic incident involving the death of a young, rising executive in a firm, and the kind of, and that anguished letter from her mother, which emotionally talked about how she felt that child had literally been driven, right? Of course, it is a mother grieving, and from an emotional perspective, but the kind of virality of that post and the kind of emotions it evoked and stirred, and a whole lot of conversations around what is acceptable and not acceptable in the name of a professional career. How far should you go? How far should you push people or not push people? Now we can say it was one more thing, it will die down. But the fact that it brought that alive, and now there might be so many other instances like that, and it might be happening all the time, right? Or when some years ago, when there was the movement of saying that it also happened to me, for women, and holding up their hand and talking about sexual harassment, etc. Right? Now, these were already there. These were swept under the carpet. These were considered to be something which were between the individual and the organization, and not really something that you put out into the public domain. But today, when there is a face and a name and an emotion, and you see what happens to that family. So For example, when the airlines were collapsing, right? Now, for the better part, and they were collapsing on the back of various dodgy kinds of policies, etc., and so on. So I think a lot of us read that. A lot of us were, but were we actually emotionally affected by it? I don't think so. Until the time when you saw employees come out on, say that they had been missing their EMI for months, that they had no jobs, that they were out on the street begging for compensation, and the Kingfisher employees and the Jet employees and everyone. And suddenly, for a country which believes that, okay, these are all very privileged people, right? So you alluded to that in your very first framing of the question. White collar crime is considered to be more sort of victimless, because after all, they're not people in griming a difficult a situation as the blue collar, as disadvantaged and as difficult and unfortunate circumstances. So for that reason, they're seen as people who are privileged. Again, if they're people who worked in a sector which is seen as glamorous, like airlines or movie stars or the hospitality industry, there is a sort of a thing that these people had it coming anyway. They had all the privileges and good, and in fact they've been held accountable to something, to that, unless and until you see the human face of that. So I think that from an education perspective, it is important for the corporate to remember that it is first a decimation of the trust that people put in you as a brand, right? One might argue sometimes that the brand has more responsibility than the corporate itself, right? And where there is a brand, then there is a more visible face. What do I mean by that? Suppose some of the most impressive personal care brands that we've grown up with, if you figured that they were doing something which was not right, you would find that there is a great hue and cry around that. There's a great emotional angst around that, because that is not faceless. That is something that I have developed a relationship with, and that there is betrayal around that. But when it comes to white crime as well, to the extent that it's been betraying the aspirations of those people, that it takes many victims. Many of those victims you do not see. Many of the lives and the way that and their hopes and aspirations for the future are dashed, because of that. So we have this tendency to wait for someone to visualize that for us in a very sensational and a dramatic way, and the report of somebody's suicide or somebody's graphic suffering, for us to then think of it as, oh, there is a human angle to the entire thing. I think it's for the corporates to think about that very hard and think about the consequences of the fact that it makes victims of everyone in the path. Some of them are seen and some of them are unseen, and that sensitivity and that culture of the people we serve, even when it's not a customer directly, or where you don't have a financial transaction with them, in a sense of responsibility to the community at large. So I think it's useless to sit and talk about CSR budgets and what you do, that in that 2 crore or 3 crore you're responsible. But in every action that is informed by, the way you deal with your employees and their families and the stakeholders, that is real, a sense of responsibility, right? Towards them, and a sense of honesty and fairness towards that. So for that, you need a lot more reflection, I believe. And yeah, since the system will allow you to get away or not get away with things, that's not an excuse for you to actually, educate yourself and be ahead of the curve on this.
So I think in that same line, I think if we put the shoe on the other side, in terms of employees, individuals, companies, vendors, we frequently witness, several unethical practices. Let me call it unethical right off the bat.
Right.
By employees. So, for example, expense claim reimbursements. You claim for expenses that you actually never incurred, or you produce fake invoices. And even vendors, suppliers, padding invoices, charging you more, overcharging, billing fraud. So what's your take on these acts? So this is now not companies, but individuals themselves.
No, very sadly and very rightly, you've pointed this out. I feel that, again, that's part of the culture that we fostered right from the start, about grabbing whatever you can. And sort of, as long as you're not doing something which is rank, you're not breaking the law in such a way, taking these liberties, inflating a few costs here and there, passing on a few expense accounts here and there, and it's like a wink nod, a quid pro quo within the system that, what's the big deal? इनके पास इतना पैसा है तो थोड़ा सा हो जाएगा तो क्या होगा? So that very either the attitude that how does it matter, and the point that the others in the system feel that they will somehow, they either indifferent and cynical themselves to that, saying it's not my problem, not my lookout. Somebody's doing, even somebody who doesn't do it personally believes that okay, it doesn't really matter as long as I'm not getting pulled into something. And a lot of the people who don't do it, they don't do it because they're morally superior. They're just afraid of being caught. So when they actually see someone who's being a bit of a cowboy, they think that this person is actually, and I've had personal experience of dealing with people like this. And I think my first response was one of shock that someone would actually do that, because you have an implicit belief that people would not do that. And once you confront the individual with that, and you realize that in their head it's not a big deal at all, and if they're caught, they simply say, okay, I'll withdraw the bill or something, and you realize that there is a certain cynicism in the system. It does come because we came from governmental backgrounds, and we came from a system that worked on bribes and greasing the palms and getting your way into a system, and then exploiting that system in your favor, because after all, that system has exploited you. No matter what, I think that has to change. There are companies who have zero tolerance towards that. And, they are very swift. And I remember that in one of those cases, it was pointed out that these car claims were being consistently inflated, and the CFO took a look at them and said that this person is charging this amount, and we know the distance between her house and the office, and that amount is changing on different days, and it's consistently being put in. And the response of the person when they were confronted, that was so, it's been going on for like 3 or 4 years. Why are you now saying that it is that? So what's the big deal? If I make a little more on some days or make a little less, how does it impact you in the larger scheme of things? Or we could have just built it to a project, and so what's the big problem? Of course, that was a zero tolerance area, and a person was asked to leave. And many people actually thought that was a very over the top response to what was, after all, a small error of judgment or misdemeanor or sort of a casual approach to something. But that does not constitute fraud, because, there are so, and always we will talk about scale and say when there are people who are defrauding a company of hundreds and thousands, and when there are people who are making so much money off this, and when you are going out handing bribes or other things outside the system, how come that? So there is a sort of moral bankruptcy around that. There is not much line in the sand, around that. And where it is discretionary, that I can claim, but I should not in the fitness of things. Most people are okay to, get away with what they want to. They can't see that as fraud. So that zero tolerance for something which is really constitutes fraud in that sense, because you're actually, whether the principle of it is, whether it is for 150 rupees taxi ride that you inflated the thing, or for some very large thing, until we break that culture of casualness about it and say chalta hai, around it. I think thankfully now we see that all that chalta hai in, for example, in Bangalore, now you see the sort of rage and anger against civic issues, right? And because those directly affect you, right? And against things that happen in the education system or the food system or whatever, right? Even if those people are representing a minority, they speak for all of us. And then there is a lot of people then that builds up into something about being more aware, being more, I think, in the balance between the responsibilities I have and some of the little perks, it is justified by saying that anyway, there are no perks. So it's the same principle. In Hindi, we say that गुनाह करना गुनाह नहीं है, पकड़े जाना गुनाह होता है. So if you can get away
Mm.
with something and it's not, and you have so much more. I'm a little player in this, and we're talking about hundreds and thousands, and and somehow a rich person and a corporate entity normally represents, personifies a rich individual, a set of people. What's the big deal? आप राजा महाराजा जैसे भेंट में इतने सारे चीजें दे देते थे. सो बहती हुई गंगा में एक दो डुबकी लगा लिया तो किसको फर्क पड़ा? So that moral turpitude is not there about those things. And you're right, those are things which are principally wrong. But unless our education system reflects that instead, and I think as parents today we're conflicted between uh, teaching people to do the right thing and teaching people to do the smart thing and get ahead in a competitive. And as long as we define ourselves as competitive and less privileged than others, and therefore, people will take advantage of us. So we in turn must make sure that we are not taken advantage of and occasionally exploit the system. If we are conflicted about those areas ourselves, about what defines success, so there are lots of people who think of Malia and Modi as people who got caught, but they got caught. There are many others who didn't. So there might be some kinds of cowboys or folk heroes you were celebrating before all that happened, right? That these are
Mm.
ballsy people who, sort of took the system head on and, and they gave a good ride while it lasted. So I think that rot is much, deeper than that. But surely corporates could spend much more time through their HR systems, etc., to really embrace the culture that people are coming into in the ecosystem and spend time walking the talk on that rather than only giving you a bunch of policies and you are entitled to 10 days of leave and 14 days of paid leave and all. Okay, that's the rule book, but really living the culture values. And of course it's modeled a lot by leadership teams and the way they do that. But zero tolerance areas need to be sort of role modeled and laid out, because if you think that you leave it to a person's conscience to do that, that's a very loose definition of anything and everything as Indians were able to pass off as it's okay, chalta hai, it happens, and it's all part of the corporate game for some reason. So morality is not something that we necessarily invoke, and unless it's big time things that you have done, how can you even think of this as fraudulent behavior in the popular parlance?
I think it's a challenging environment, of course, for both companies and individuals, given this fabric of culture, then education, then the various opportunities that present themselves to make a quick buck.
Right.
Those I think seem more amplified these days with social media, fraud, influencers, and whatnot in this new age. What should companies be doing as it is they face this challenge of educating employees and walk the talk, like you said, adding on this complexity of social media influencers, the internet, stuff which didn't exist in this pace and sphere more, about even 10 years ago. How do companies then take a proactive approach in ensuring the right tone, the right culture, and aligning their brand values and employees?
So I think that first, I think what has happened is that today, fortunately, companies are not given that option of not engaging, right? So when we advise the largest brands in this country, and we tell them that just because you have 50 years behind you or 60 years behind you, it doesn't mean that you have the option to not communicate and not engage. So this taken for grantedness or the ji hajuri that was there, right? That I've been around for so long. And so you cannot take your trust for granted. And I think that has gotten amplified a lot in the space of, online, or like say FMCG is a prime example of that, right? That the largest and the most reputed brands are now struggling. And why are they struggling? Not because their products are not nice, or their products are not good, or that they are suddenly irrelevant, but there are younger, lighter, smaller versions available on every shop shelf or in virtually, who are giving them a run for their money. And what is that based on? So obviously they lack the mega brands and they lack the mega presence of it. But what they do have is personalization, right? They have that sense of transparency. They have that sense of communication. They have that sense of a direct outreach, right? And I think the rules of the game are simple. We're willing to forgive, sometimes even overlook the mistakes or the deficiencies of something, of someone who's new and struggling and perceived as the underdog, versus we are of a large established behemoth, right? Because somewhere we feel very happy when those people are brought to account because they were. So that sense of however large you might be in the marketplace, that culture of being communicative, that culture of understanding that you are going to be called to account. You are, so it's like the emperor's new clothes, right? So it is all visible to everyone. And there is anyone and everyone who can take a pot shot at you. Sometimes it might be fair and sometimes it would be unfair. But for example, you may have a customer helpline or you might have a customer complaints division. But today, you and I will just go and post on Insta and Facebook and wherever else when we are unhappy. That is our
Right.
method, right? Of
Yeah.
visibly holding someone to account, right? So the fact that it is now becoming a system which is much more transparent, it is a system where the customer and the consumer, it's truly a good time to be a consumer and a customer because you are finally getting that whole sense of power and thing. Yes, it is also an sort of media, like you said, that can be misused. There are influencers who are being paid to say things, etc. But for every one person like that, there are also others who are doing a job of education. For example, what Revant is doing with Food Farmer and sort of educating people on, hey, listen, what's on the label? Learn how to read what's on a label. This is food at the end of the day. And basically, you should know what you're signing up for. And if you're then okay with whatever you're being fed, that's fine. But so today that, and I think that was a very Western concept where, people would be very careful about whatever they said and did, etc. For what reason? Because they can be sued for that. Now we are not a culture of suing. You don't actually, I mean, you make a few noises here and there, and that's about it. So, but here to stand up for your own rights or to demand transparency. So I think large organizations and brands have that responsibility to come at it with a position of humility, to understand that you cannot take anything for granted, and to demonstrate at every single time how you are becoming more and more relevant and that you're listening. So, for example, if a company is talking about sustainability and then they are sending you stuff in loads of plastic, then that begs the argument, right? And somebody is going to point that out. In the past, it would have just been transactional, or you would have just taken it at face value. And we all have, just like there are the holy cows of education and medicine and religion, where the person can do no wrong until proven to do so. You instinctively and intuitively believe. The same belief system says that large brands can never actually do anything wrong because they have their reputation at stake. They have so much and they have had such a track record of trust and credibility that even a small slip up will feel like a major betrayal. So, in fact, all the more that the scrutiny is going to happen, the scrutiny is even going to happen by people who have nothing in it, and it may not be particularly intelligent or well thought through or logical. They could be trolling, they could be that. You do have influencers who help you to communicate and get your point across. But over a period of time, if you're not going to be walking the talk, by what those influencers are saying, and then actually experience the product and you figure out that that was all sort of just advertising and it was all just, in fact, when you see an ad on social, if you see a ad on TV, etc., you're still seeing it and saying, this is an ad. Or this is just some creative, smart way of praising yourself a little more, and I don't literally take it at face value. But when you involve a influencer, when you involve so-called customers and they're praising or they're talking about, or you get employees to talk about on Glassdoor about what the company is like, or you have videos floating around, or you have claims and things that seniors are making, well, those are all real people. And so the appeal is also in them. It's a double-edged sword. And the moment you figure out that these people are actually not what they are, or the brand is even 1% less than what I thought that they were saying, that backlash is immediate. And it is deafening, and it becomes like a PR crisis that you're then trying to rescue. Engaging with your employees with a sense of transparency, and so that they are not the last people to hear about something, to engage with consumers, but from a position of humility, particularly from, like now in HR, we all know that policy that you have, that you give feedback, but why did the policy of reverse feedback start? Precisely so that, that loop is complete and it's all not top down. there is going to be a lot of noise over there. You can choose to say which part of it you will engage with or not, but you don't have a choice not to engage and say, after all, what do these people know? Or I know I'm good enough, etc. It's in communication theory, we say, you may send out any signal. It becomes a message when a person receives, and your signal and that message might be different. That does not matter. Once it is decoded, that's what the receiver receives as the message. Doesn't really matter what you believed was what you said, or that your intent was something else. So I think that position of engaging, not seducing, not bypassing, or not controlling the narrative, that we have to grow up and we have to learn how to do that with people.
I think on that note, we will end this podcast. Certainly been a very interesting discussion around brand, reputation, culture. And I think companies have a lot to do, and so do individuals and vendors. So I think all of us have a equally important role to play if we have to walk the talk. So thank you, Nirupama, for sharing your insights and
Thank you
time.
so much, Vidya, and more power to you in getting people to sort of reflect on these issues, which may not immediately occur to someone in the context of fraud or corporate governance, and see that in the end it's about people and our implications on the ecosystem, and embrace that rather than stick to just the straight and the narrow. Thanks so much.
Thank you.